So this lecture is for the first half of chapter 6, which is reading uh, about literature. Primarily, we're dealing with short fiction, but this also works for any type of literature, whether it's novels or drama or poetry. So what we have to look at is analyzing the literature. So we separate into distinct parts in order to, and then put those parts back together to kind of understand the whole. So what we want to look at is plot. With plot, we're not talking about just the events that occur, but we're also talking about the conflict within in the plot, and we'll go into that more in depth a little later. So the conflict is not necessarily the conflict, between two people fighting, but we're talking about a conflict where somebody, normally the protagonist, wants something very badly, and something is keeping that protagonist from accomplishing or grabbing the desires. Uh, and this builds usually to a climax where either the desire is completely put out of reach, which is not what normally happens, or whatever needs to be overcome is overcome in order for the protagonist to obtain what the protagonist desires. We also look at the protagonist, we look at the other main characters, we look at how they're developed. We especially look at the protagonist and see if there's a change at some point in the protagonist. Most of the times, especially in literature, during and after the modern period, so we're talking about 1915, 1920, things written after that time, normally have a protagonist that has this major change, has an epiphany and changes. Um, and so we analyze all of that, and we respond to that. And you should be annotating as you're reading and looking for certain clues regarding this, and writing down questions about the works you're looking at. And you should be looking at symbols. So symbols tend to be objects that represent more than what they appear to be on the surface. So an umbrella could be more than just an umbrella. Things along those lines. And we'll talk about symbols later on in the class as well. Now, the form that you're looking at, this is the overall shape of the story. So there's basic forms. The ones that we'll be looking at mostly are tragedies, uh, where some hero falls from a great height uh, in the eyes of the people around that hero. Or there's comedy, which, just the humorous aspect of life. Sometimes it can be bittersweet comedy, but where there isn't this great fall by a hero. Uh, there's a gentleman named Calvino who wrote in the 20th century, an Italian writer, who said in tragedy the hero dies, and in comedy the hero gets married. We also have fables, which are a genre not used a great deal in modern writing. This is from late, in our past, but there are fabulous now, where there's a deal of surrealism, a great deal of uh, imaginative characteristics that couldn't occur in actual life. And then there's parable, and this is where the story is written to give a certain lesson. You always hear about Jesus talking in parables, that the stories that Jesus told were to convey a certain lesson, and that's what your parables are. But like I said, in this class, we're mostly going to be looking at tragedy and comedy. Now, where you want to focus on setting. Uh, People pick particular settings to place their stories in because not only the freedom the setting may give the writer as to what the writer can write, but also the restrictions. If you're writing something written that takes place, the setting is late 1800s London, that is very different from writing a story that takes place in 21st century New York City. And so those you have to consider because each one adds or takes away from the story in certain ways. You look at the characters, what type of characters do we have? One of the things we really want to be aware of is whether we have a reliable narrator. So sometimes the narrator is actually a character in the story or is just a character telling the story that never actually takes a role within the story. And there's times when that narrator may not be telling us the truth. And so we have to kind of judge for ourselves whether we can trust what the narrator is telling us. I always just say it's like you've got a friend who tells you how horrible Susie is and how she's a terrible person and you can't trust her. She's a backstabber, da 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 da. And when you get to meet Susie, and it turns out Susie's a really nice person, but then you find out the friend that told you Susie was the way she was uh, used to date Susie's current boyfriend. So probably an unreliable narrator. All right, foils. These are characters that tend to be one-dimensional, and they are primarily there to draw out some specific character or to show us some aspect of the main character. And so they don't really add to the story so much as they are adding to our knowledge of the main character, the protagonist. Your plot, like I said, the plot is not just the events that occur, but it's the conflicts that occur and the causal relationship of events, how one causes another to occur. Point of view is also something to look at. We have a number of points of view. Uh, we normally don't see second person, the you point of view. It was tried in the 60s and 70s with experimental fiction and didn't work very well. Mostly we have first person I point of view, so we're getting everything from one character's view who's saying I saw this, I saw that. Or we have the third person, the you, which an awful lot of literature is written in, and then there's different aspects of that. There's full omniscience where in the third person, we know everything that's occurring in every character's mind, and there's limited omniscience where we only know certain things about each character's can get in within certain, and then there's this fly on the wall where we can't get to any character's mind. We can just observe. So it's kind of like we're just a fly on the wall watching what's occurring. And then symbols, as I said, these are items that normally they'll reoccur in a story. They're recurring. And we don't just see the symbol once. This is the fact that one of the clues we look for is seeing the symbol occurring again and again within a story that tips us off that it's probably a symbol. And again, it's something that, or something that is out of place. And so represents something else. So James Joyce has a wonderful story called Araby, and he's going to a fair, and he asks his uncle for money, and this is like in 1920 Ireland, and his uncle gives him a florin. Well, a florin tends to be an Italian currency, but there were florins in England or in Ireland at this time. Uh, but it's unusual. Normally they would have something like a threepence or sixpence, a threepenny piece or a sixpenny piece. The florin stands out as being something strange, and it has great relevance to the story because of what's on the florin, the two different sides. But anyway, so and then we look at theme, and we kind of put all of these things together that we've been talking about in order to come up with what's the theme. So the theme isn't what is the story about? It's what's about the about. What is the story telling us other than the events that occur? Why these events in this order with these characters, with these changes occurring? And so what you do is you look at the different parts and see how they fit together. You look for what's missing. So these are called gaps. And you need to be aware that certain information isn't given to you. Because if you were given all the information, it wouldn't be very interesting to read a story. I mean, one of the fun things about reading a story is trying to figure out for yourself what's going on below the surface of the story. It's kind of like if you were to watch a detective story on like CSI or Law and Order on television, and they tell you right away who's committed the crime. Well, then why are you watching the rest of the show? The fun part is being able to try to figure out who committed the crime prior to being told, by the story itself. And so this is what these gaps are, things that are missing that you have to fill in with your own logical thinking. And then what type of language is used? So here I've got the word harlot, which is a loose woman. That is a term primarily used in Britain. It's not a term that we hear in the United States very often, and really Britain of the Victorian era. So if you've got a more modern story that's using the language such as harlot, it's harkening back to that. So why that particular word? Instead of just saying, somebody who's promiscuous. All right, and then you have different types of alternative analysis, which we're going to do a complete short lecture on the different ways to look at this. So there are all sorts of what are called literary theories as to how to look at stories. There's not just one way to go at this. So the example I give here is gender criticism. So you can look at who wrote it, male or female, how are the different genders represented within the work itself, and how does that then influence how you interpret. You can compare to other works. I highly recommend this possibly for your research paper of comparing a work that you really like with some other work that's similar that will allow you to draw out similarities and differences. And this is especially true for poetry. You have to look at various translations. So an awful lot of literature is written in foreign languages, of course, and some translations are better than others. For an example, one of my favorite poets is Pablo Neruda, but I was so fortunate that the first book of his poetry I ever read was just a beautiful, beautiful translation. I loved the book so much I went out and got a second book, and it was horribly translated. I hated that poetry, but it's written by the same man. It's just the person translating did a poor job of it. So it's not just a critical thing as to what's better or worse as far as the translation. It's what's brought to the translation, what's not brought to the translation that you can look at as well. And remember, all of your analysis just needs to be reasonable. What I like about literature is that you really can't be wrong because it's your interpretation. If that's your interpretation, then that's your interpretation. But you do need to try to make sure that you can reasonably support. Now, summary is not analysis. Please be aware of that. I've had papers come in this class where basically were 8th grade book reports have just told me what went on in the story. Well, I read the story. I know what went on in it. I don't need a summary of that, and that's not analysis. You may need to summarize small sections to lend support to whatever your point is, but do not summarize the entire work. And what you want is just a synopsis of the main points. And there should be some brief relation of that to the plot. Like I'm saying, there's got to be some reason for summarizing a part of it. So you want it to be briefer than the original. You're going to leave out most of the concrete details, which we're talking about there, is that a description, things like that. You want it to be accurate. Should be written in the present tense. So James is always doing whatever James was doing in the story. 250 words or less, so a single paragraph if you're going to summarize. You may not always have the same chronology. You can summarize, the beginning and then go to the end and then go back to the middle or switch things around. Quotation marks are not necessary when you're doing a summary. Make sure you mention the title and the author. So you should say, in James Joyce's work, Araby, and then go on to summarize it. Now, paraphrasing, this is just placing in your own words. And you do this because you want to simplify a text. You're sometimes longer than the original, so that's perfectly fine. A lot of times, like with Shakespeare, it's language that's not used as much now, a lot of it, and so you would want to put it into more modern language when you paraphrase and put it in your own words, and that may end up being longer. You're not allowed to use the same words, phrases, or sentence structures when you're paraphrasing. It's got to be all your own.